The day the galaxy threw us out, I was sitting 3 rows behind Ambassador Oliver Crane, close enough to watch the muscles in the back of his neck go completely still. The chamber was cold. It was always cold on So's ether station. The architects who designed it belonged to a species that found warmth biologically distressing. And since the Galactic Cooperative ran the station, the temperature inside the Grand Conclave Hall stayed at a level that made every human diplomat reach for their coat. I am Cira Vose. I spent 19 years working as a translator and cultural liaison for Earth's diplomatic corps. I speak 7 alien languages without a machine assist, and I have sat through more political proceedings than I can count. I thought I had seen everything this galaxy had to show me. I thought, walking into that hall on the morning of the vote, that I was prepared for whatever came next. I was not prepared for how fast it happened. The Grand Arbiter, a Velan named Selvaran, would wait for the room to settle. The gavel had barely struck the resonance plate before his voice came through the translation relay, flat and final, the way a door sounds when it locks from the outside. The Galactic Cooperative, he said, had reached a decision regarding the status of the human species in all territories under human administration. The vote had been conducted over the previous 72 hours. The result was unanimous. Unanimous. I looked around the chamber. 640 delegate pods arranged in a sweeping arc that curved upward toward the vaulted ceiling. Each pod held a representative from one of the Cooperative's member civilizations. I had worked alongside some of these beings for years. I had shared meals with the Tavith delegation, learned the 47 ceremonial greetings of the Oral, sat through a 14-hour musical mediation with the Sen Collective, and not one of them had voted against this. Selvaran began reading the formal charge list. The first charge was something called unreasonable persistence in hazardous environments. The Cooperative's Research Commission had compiled data showing that humans continued to inhabit, expand, and thrive on planets rated Class Omega under the Cooperative's lethality index, a scale that went from 1 to 10. Class Omega meant the index had exceeded 10. It meant the world was by every scientific standard the Cooperative accepted too dangerous to support any intelligent species. Humans had 37 active colonies on Class Omega worlds. Selvaran read every world's name aloud. It took 4 minutes. The second charge was aberrant risk tolerance leading to galactic destabilization. 3 human-led expeditions in the last decade had entered regions of space. The Cooperative had been sealed off as structurally unsafe. 1 expedition had returned. The Cooperative presented this as evidence of recklessness. I had read the expedition report. The one that came back had brought 17 terabytes of data that human scientists were still working through. Selvaran did not mention that part. The third charge was harder to summarize. The Cooperative's language for it was long and formal, but what it meant, stripped down to its bones, was this. Humans made other species uncomfortable by existing near them. There was a phenomenon the Cooperative had been documenting for 50 years, ever since first contact. They called it the unease. It was a measurable physiological and psychological stress response that occurred in members of most cooperative species when humans were in proximity. No one could fully explain it. The Cooperative's medical researchers had published 14 papers trying. The leading theory was that other species on some deep and ancient biological level could sense that humans operated by a different set of rules. That they looked at danger and felt something other than the instinct to retreat. It made everyone else nervous. The fourth charge was the one that almost made me laugh. It was filed under excessive and disruptive adaptability. The Cooperative had spent the past century building an interstellar civilization on a foundation of predictable behavior. Every member species had clear, well-documented limits. Their tolerances for temperature, radiation, atmospheric pressure, social conflict, and resource scarcity were on file, updated annually, used to coordinate everything from colony placement to diplomatic scheduling. Humans did not fit any of those models. Every time the Cooperative's analysts built a framework to predict what humans would do next, humans did something else. Selvaran called this destabilizing. He said the Cooperative could not function effectively with a member whose behavior could not be forecasted. Oliver Crane wrote something in his notebook. I could not see what it was from where I sat today. I watched him write it, cap the pen, and set it down on the desk in front of him with the careful deliberateness of a man who was thinking clearly and had nothing to prove. Then he folded his hands. Selvaran moved to the sentence. Effective immediately, the Cooperative was severing all formal ties with Earth and its administered territories. Human vessels would be denied access to Cooperative transit corridors. Human diplomatic credentials would be revoked. Cooperative trade licenses held by human businesses would be suspended pending review, which was cooperative language for suspended permanently. The communication relay network, which Earth had been connected to for 60 years, would be closed to human signals within 30 days. The human species would be in every practical sense alone. The word Selva used was banished. The chamber went very quiet after that. 640 delegations, and none of them made a sound. I think they expected something from us. Tears, maybe, or protest, or the kind of desperate diplomatic scrambling I had seen from other civilizations facing censure. One of the cooperative's founding members, a species called the Merithe, had spent 11 days delivering emotional appeals when threatened with reduced trade status a decade ago. 11 days. Oliver Crane stood up. The room tightened. Selvaround's crest feathers, the velvet equivalent of eyebrows, rose slightly. Crane buttoned his jacket, just the top button. He did it the way you might button a jacket before stepping out into a light rain. Unhurried and practical. Then he picked up his notebook, tucked it under his arm, and looked across the chamber itself with an expression I can only describe as polite. Not angry, not sad, politely interested. The way you might look at someone who has just told you something you already knew and waiting for them to catch up on. He said on behalf of Earth and all human-administered territories, he formally acknowledged the cooperative's decision. He thanked the orbiter for the clarity of the process. He said that humanity wished every member civilization well. Then he sat back down. The chamber did not know what to do with that. I watched delegations lean toward each other, translators working overtime, and Tin and Crest Feathers moving in confusion. Selvaran cleared his throat and said the session was closed. The gavel struck the resonance plate again. It was over in 11 minutes from the first word to the last. The trial that ended humanity's place in galactic civilization took 11 minutes. I fell into step beside Crane as we filed out through the corridor behind the human delegation's pod. I had worked with him for 3 years. I had never seen him anything other than controlled, but I had also never seen him look quite like this. There was something in his face that I could not immediately name. I asked him what he had written in the notebook. He held it out without breaking stride. I opened it to the page. 3 words in his small, precise handwriting. Finally, no oversight. I stopped walking. 2 junior etchers from our team nearly collided with me from behind. I stood there in the cold corridor of Swaz Ether Station with the noise of 600 delegations moving around me, and I read those 3 words again. And then I understood the look on Crane's face. It was a relief. I caught up to him and fell back into step. I looked at the rest of our team. 10 humans, various ages, various titles, various years of experience. Every single one of them was carrying themselves the same way Crane was. Back straight, chin level, moving through the crowd of alien species the way you move through a crowd when you know exactly where you are going and you are not in any particular hurry because you have already figured out the path. Some of the alien delegates watched us pass. A Tavith representative pressed against the wall to let us by, her secondary eyes blinking rapidly. The sign I had learnt meant acute anxiety. A pair of oral officials stopped talking entirely when we walked past them and did not start again until we were around the corner. I heard through my translation earpiece a fragment of their conversation. They were wondering why we were not upset. I almost stopped again. I wanted to turn around and explain it to them. I wanted to say we are not upset because we were not afraid of this. You were afraid of us. You have been afraid of us since the first day we docked at a cooperative station. And the intake officer took our biological readings and called her supervisor. And her supervisor called his. And the 3 of them stood there staring at our medical profiles because our stress hormone levels under what the cooperative classified as a high-threat scenario were lower than the vehicle's resting readings on a calm afternoon. You have been filing reports about us for 60 years. 14 papers on the unease, and not one of them asked the obvious question. What if we are not the problem? What if you built a civilization around the assumption that the universe was something to be survived carefully, and we arrived having spent 100,000 years learning that it was something to be engaged with directly? But I did not turn around. I kept walking. We all did, the 10 of us, down the corridor and through the departure bay and back onto the human transport that would take us home. Crane sat across from me on the shuttle. He had the notebook open again. He was writing something else. I did not ask this time. Outside the viewport, Sol's Ethos Station grew smaller. The cooperative's grand architecture, all curved silver arches and cascading light arrays pulled back into the black. It was genuinely beautiful. I had always thought so. I looked at it until it disappeared. Then I looked at Crane. He finished writing, capped the pen, and looked up at me. "How long?" I asked. "Do you think it will take them?" He considered this. Not the answer. I could see from his face that he already had the answer. He was considering how to phrase it. 30 years, he said, give or take. I nodded. That matched my estimate. Outside, the stars did not care one way or the other. They had been burning for billions of years before the cooperative existed, and they would go on burning long after every diplomatic session in the Grand Conclave was ancient history. I found this thought not frightening, but deeply, genuinely comforting. We were going home, and unlike every other species that had ever been told they were on their own, we already knew what to do when we got there. 32 years after the cooperative vote, I retired to Kepler 438b. I want to be very clear about what that means. The cooperative's classification of Kepler 438b assigned in their third stellar survey was class Omega Lethality Index 11.4. Their report, which I had read in full during my second year as a liaison, described the planet's atmosphere as marginally breathable under controlled conditions, its soil as chemically hostile to most known organic compounds, its seasonal radiation cycles as a significant barrier to long-term habitation, and its native fauna as aggressively territorial at all observed scales. I grew tomatoes there. They were extraordinary. The farmhouse sat on a ridge above the settlement of Port Kalin, which had grown from a research outpost of 40 people to a town of 12,000 in the years since the banishment. The air was thin enough that newcomers needed 2 weeks to adjust, and the sky turned a deep amber color every evening as the radiation filters built into the atmospheric processes caught the day's peak output. It was without question the most beautiful sunset I had ever seen. I watched it from my porch every night. My neighbor across the ridge was a man named George Farrow. He was 63, a former geological engineer who had come to Kepler 4308b on the second wave of settlement and had since developed what he called a consulting business and what I called a habit of going places that made the younger settlers nervous. He knocked on my door the morning after I arrived, handed me a jar of something he had fermented from a local plant that tasted like apple cider crossed with something electrical, and told me that the settlement's central relay was out again and would I mind having a look. I told him I had been retired for 8 hours. He said the relay had been out for 6. I had a look at the relay. This is how the first year of my retirement went. I was theoretically done. 19 years in diplomatic service, 12 more consulting for Earth's new expansion office after the banishment, and then a pension, a small research stipend, and a farmhouse on a planet that the cooperative had written off as uninhabitable. I was supposed to read, write a little, tend my tomatoes, sleep more than 6 hours a night for the first time in a decade. Instead, I found myself doing what every retired human in every human settlement on every improbable planet in the human republic seemed to do, being useful, because doing nothing felt structurally unsound. The Republic, it still caught me sometimes when I said it, the human republic. We had not planned that name in advance. It emerged organically from a series of settlement councils in the first 5 years after the banishment. Each one operates independently. Each one arrived at the same conclusion that what they needed was not a government in the old cooperative membership sense, but something lighter and faster. A framework that coordinated without controlling, that set minimum standards without mandating uniformity. It was, a political scientist on Earth once told me, the least elegant governmental structure in recorded history. It worked extremely well. The cooperative had assumed, cutting us off, that isolation would do the work for them. They had modeled it. Their economic projections, which I obtained years later through a source who preferred not to be named, showed that without access to cooperative trade routes, Earth's material standard would decline by 40% within a decade. Their sociological models predicted civil unrest within 15 years. Their demographic models showed population plateaus followed by decline as resource pressure mounted. Every single model was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in one direction or another. Wrong in a way that tells you the underlying assumptions were bad at the foundation. The cooperative economists had built their projections on the premise that humans, like every other species, would struggle most in conditions of scarcity and isolation. They had never seriously entertained the possibility that humans found scarcity clarifying. Without cooperative trade, Earth's engineers had 18 months to solve the supply problems or face genuine hardship. They solved them in 14. The closed-loop food synthesis systems that came out of that period were so efficient, so scalable, and so adaptable to varied planetary conditions that within a decade, the word famine had begun to exit the practical vocabulary of every human settlement that adopted them. It did not disappear from history books, but it stopped being a thing that happened. Energy followed a similar arc. The cooperative's ethics boards had maintained a list of restricted research categories, things they considered too dangerous or too destabilizing for member species to pursue freely. 34 categories in total. Snorts. 22 of them involved energy production and propulsion. The reasoning, as best I ever understood it, was that some technologies created risks that one civilization pursuing them independently could not adequately assess, and that the cooperative's coordinated review process was safer than unilateral development. It was a reasonable argument in principle. In practice, it meant that for 60 years, human physicists had been working around a fence. The moment the cooperative removed us from the review process, those physicists walked through the gap and kept going. Within 8 years, 2 of the 22 restricted categories yielded breakthroughs that changed the shape of human expansion entirely. I am not a physicist, and I will not try to explain the mechanics of either discovery, but the effect was this. Human ships that had once needed 4 months to reach the nearest class alpha worlds could reach them in 11 days. And the energy required to power a settlement on a class over the world dropped by a factor that made every previous cost projection obsolete. The cooperative had not to strand us. Instead, they had cut the rope that was holding us in place. And then there was medicine. The cooperative's medical research community was genuinely excellent. I want to say that plainly because what I am about to describe is not a criticism of their intentions. They had developed treatments for conditions that had killed billions of beings across dozens of species, and they shared that knowledge freely within the membership. The cooperative's medical charter was one of the things I had genuinely admired about the organization. But the charter also prohibited certain categories of research that the cooperative's bioethics panels considered too close to fundamental biological modification. The line they drew was intended to prevent harm. It also, as a consequence, prevented a specific category of work that human researchers had been quietly developing for 40 years, submitting for review every 3 years and being quietly declined every 3 years. 16 months after the banishment, the first paper was published. It described a cellular repair mechanism that, to summarize, drastically addressed the primary biological process associated with age-related decline in human tissue. This is not the language the researchers used. The language they used was technical and careful and 26 pages long. But the effect as it moved through clinical trials over the following decade was that the human lifespan began to extend. Not infinitely, not magically, but measurably, meaningfully, in ways that compounded with every generation. I think about this sometimes when I do the math. I am 81 years old as I write this. By the cooperative's original biological models for humans, I should be approaching the end of my functional years. I am not. I hiked 8 kilometers with George Farrow last week up the ridge and back, and the only reason we stopped when we did was that the sunset was too good to walk through. My cooperative contact, the diplomat who had reached out years ago through the smuggler's relay, sent me another message in the 15th year. Her name was Voral, a Velan analyst who had always been more curious than her colleagues, and who had spent most of the banishment years watching human space with an attention she described to me as professionally motivated, and which I suspected was something more like fascination. Her message was 3 sentences long. We have observed the food synthesis data. We have observed the energy figures. We do not understand what we are seeing. I wrote back one sentence. We are doing what we always do. She did not reply for 6 months. When she did, it was not to answer. It was to tell me that the cooperative's immigration office had begun receiving applications from member species citizens wishing to relocate to human space. Not many at first, dozens, then hundreds across a range of species. Velan, Taveth, Oral. 3 species whose names I had barely learned during my liaison years. They cited various reasons: better medical access, stronger economic opportunity. One family of Taveth, a species I had always thought of as deeply risk-averse, gave as their reason in a formal application: we want to live somewhere where things are still being figured out. I read that line 3 times. George Farrow knocked on my door that same evening. He had heard from the Settlement Council that the 6th application for Taveth residency had come in that week. He wanted to know what I thought. I told him they were welcome. He said that was what he thought too, and that he had already told the council as much, and that he had come over because he had. I needed another batch of the fermented thing, and did I want to try the new version? The new version was better. We sat on the porch and watched the amber sunset. And he told me about the cave system he had mapped 2 weeks ago, 3 kilometers into the eastern ridge, and the mineral formations inside it that he had never seen documented anywhere, and that he intended to go back for a second look as soon as the wind season settled. I asked him if he had told his family. He said they had told him to be careful. I asked if he was going anyway. He looked at me the way George Pharaoh looked at questions with obvious answers. By the time the 28th year arrived, the number of non-human citizens in the human republic had passed 4 million. They came quietly, family by family, individual by individual through channels that were not officially sanctioned by the cooperative, but that the cooperative's border officials seemed disinclined to monitor closely. They arrived on worlds rated Class Alpha and Class Omega alike. They learned to manage the difficulties of each one. Many of them, after a few years, developed what the cooperative would have called aberrant risk tolerance. Wanthan family on Kepler 430b started a farm 2 ridges over from mine. Their youngest, a child who had been hatched in cooperative space and moved here at age 4, grew up speaking the local human dialect without any accent at all. I saw him sometimes at the settlement market, arguing cheerfully with a Tabith merchant about the price of a particular seed variety, gesturing the way do not typically gesture, laughing the way no cooperative citizen had ever laughed in any chamber I had sat in. The galaxy was leaking into human space slowly, quietly, family by family. And in cooperative space, something else was happening. I heard it first from Voral, then confirmed it from 3 other sources, and eventually read it in the dry language of cooperative economic dispatches that still found their way to me through various channels. The cooperative's infrastructure was developing problems. Not catastrophic ones, not yet, but the kind of slow compounding problems that come from a system that has always relied on a particular component and then suddenly no longer has access to it. Human contractors had managed significant portions of the cooperative's frontier logistics for 60 years. Transit corridor maintenance, deep space relay upkeep, atmospheric processing on marginal worlds. When the banishment came, the cooperative's administrators had been confident that member species engineers could absorb these functions. They had published a transition plan. The transition plan was not going well. It was not a crisis. It was a pattern. Relay stations running slower. Transit corridor maintenance windows stretching from scheduled weeks to unscheduled months. 3 Class Beta worlds that had been comfortable had become Class Beta worlds that required supplemental support that was slow in arriving. Nothing that made headlines. Everything that made a very long document that Voral summarized for me in a message that arrived in the 29th year of the banishment with 2 words preceding the summary. They are meeting. I sat with those 2 words for a while. Frank had said 30 years, give or take. He had been in the end. I called George Pharaoh over that evening. We sat on the porch. I told him what Voral had said. He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass in his hands, watching the amber sky go dark above the ridge. Then he said, good. Just that good. I poured more of the fermented thing into both our glasses. And we sat there under the stars of Kepler 438b, a planet the galaxy had written off as impossible. And we watched the lights of Kepler come on one by one in the valley below. 12,000 people living full lives in a world that was not supposed to support them. And I thought we were never the problem they thought we were. We were always just the answer to a question they had not learned to ask yet. They were about to learn. I want to describe the first moment precisely because I wrote it down immediately after while the shuttle was still docking, while my hands were still carrying the particular kind of steady that comes not from calm but from certainty. We had known the cooperative's delegation was coming for 6 months, not from any official communication. The cooperative had not sent us a message, not through any direct channel, because that would require them to acknowledge that we existed in an official capacity, and their legal apparatus had not yet worked out how to do that without implicitly admitting the banishment had failed. Instead, we had known because Voral had told me, because 4 other sources I had cultivated across 30 years had told me, because the cooperative's own financial disclosures, which were public under their charter, and which our economic analysts read with the focused attention of people who understood exactly what to look for, had begun showing a specific pattern of expenditure that preceded a diplomatic mission. We had 6 months. We used them well. The station the cooperative's delegation was flying toward had been called Junction 7 when the cooperative built it 40 years ago as a way station on the outer edge of what had then been the human cooperative border. After the banishment, when the border ceased to exist because the cooperative stopped recognizing us, Junction 7 drifted into technical ambiguity. Nobody serviced it. Nobody claimed it. For 8 years, it sat dark and silent, running on minimal power, the kind of place that appeared on navigation charts as a small grey marker and a warning about uncertain structural status. Then a human engineering team arrived, took one look at the bones of the place, and spent 2 years rebuilding it into something that would have been unrecognizable to the original architects. It was now called a simple name: Welcome Back. I will not pretend the name was an accident. The station director was a woman named Claire Holden. I had known her for 15 years since she ran logistics for one of the early-class Omega settlement waves. And the reason I trusted her was that she had a specific quality I had always valued above most others in difficult situations. She did not perform with confidence. She simply had it. When I arrived at Welcome Back 48 hours before the cooperative's delegation, she met me in the bay with a handshake, a detailed briefing, and no preamble. The Human Republic's negotiating team was already aboard. 7 people. I was the 8th. Our lead negotiator was a man named Daniel Ford, who had spent the last decade as the Republic's chief trade architect, a title that sounded administrative, and was in fact one of the most tactically demanding roles in the government. He was 44 years old, lean and quiet, and he had prepared for this meeting with the kind of thoroughness that made the preparation invisible. When I joined his team in the conference room for our final brief, the tables were clean. There were no stacks of paper, no nervous assistants shuffling files. There were 7 people and a projected display showing nothing but the cooperative delegation's arrival time. Ford looked at me when I walked in and said simply, "Good. We can start." He walked us through the 3 positions the cooperative was likely to open with based on everything we knew about their internal debates. The first was a reinstatement offer. Humanity would be welcomed back into the cooperative as a full member on the existing terms as if the banishment had been a temporary suspension. The second was a conditional offer. Humanity would be welcomed back as a probationary member with reduced representation and enhanced monitoring protocols for a period of 25 years. The third was the one Ford thought most likely, a partnership offer framed in language designed to sound like equality, but structured in ways that would effectively maintain cooperative oversight over human expansion decisions. Ford said the correct response to all 3 was the same. Silence. Not permanent silence, not aggressive silence, just the specific, neutral, undivided silence of people who have been asked to accept something they do not need. He said we would let the cooperative delegation speak. We would listen carefully and visibly. We would ask a small number of clarifying questions, and we would not indicate a position for as long as it took for the other side to understand that the urgency in the room was entirely theirs. I had seen this tactic once before. Snorts. Oliver Crane had used a version of it in the Grand Conclave on the day they banished us, though at that point it had been more instinct than strategy. Ford had built it into an architecture. I respected that. The cooperative delegation arrived at Welcome Back Station on a Tuesday morning, local time, aboard a vessel that was newer and more formal than anything I had seen them deploy in my diplomatic years. 12 beings in total. Lead negotiator was a Velthan named Cell. Young for the role, chosen, I suspected, because the elder diplomats wanted someone who could claim ignorance of the banishment era's internal politics if anything went wrong. He was accompanied by 2 Tavath legal advisors, a pair of oral economic analysts, and several others whose species I recognized, but whose specific roles were unclear. When Orthel stepped onto the Welcome Back Station and saw the interior, he stopped. Claire Holden told me later that she had watched his crest feathers do something she had never seen a Veland's crest feathers do in a professional setting. They had gone entirely flat and then risen to full extension and then settled somewhere in the middle, which she said looked on a Velthan the way a jaw dropping and then being forced shut would look on a human. What Ordhell was seeing was a station, a fully operational, meticulously maintained, thoroughly modern station that should not have existed. The cooperative's assessment of human infrastructure development, last updated 12 years ago, had projected that without access to cooperative manufacturing supply chains, human construction projects would plateau at what they called third-tier capacity. Welcome Back Station was not third tier. It was not a cooperative standard either because it was not trying to be. It was a human standard which was its own thing, which moved faster and looked different and worked very well. Ordhell composed himself. I will give him that. By the time he walked into the conference room and took a seat across from Ford, his crest was level and his posture was formal and his translator unit was running cleanly. He was a professional. He was doing his job. Ford welcomed him. Daniel Ford had a voice that never rushed. He spoke to Ordhell with the same specific warmth you use towards someone you are meeting for the first time and intend to deal with fairly. He said he was glad the cooperative had reached out. He said the Human Republic valued dialogue. He said he hoped the transit from cooperative space had been comfortable. Orth said the transit had been fine and moved immediately to the matter at hand. He presented the cooperative's offer. It was the third option Ford had predicted, the partnership framework with oversight mechanisms buried in the language of mutual consultation. Ort Hell delivered it well. He emphasized the benefits to humanity. He used phrases like restored access and reintegration into the broader community of civilizations. He did not say what the cooperative was getting from the arrangement, but the cooperative was getting a great deal. Access to human medical technology, human energy systems, and the logistics capacity that had been slowly draining out of cooperative frontier operations for 30 years. Ford listened. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them genuinely clarifying, nothing pointed or adversarial. Then he said pleasantly that the team would need some time to consider the terms. Ort Hell said he understood. He expected the consideration to take perhaps a day or 2. Ford said that seemed reasonable and that in the meantime, he hoped Orthal's team would make use of the station's facilities. Claire Holden's team had prepared quarters, meals, and a briefing room for the cooperative delegates. They left the conference room. Ford looked at me. I looked at Ford. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Day 3. He meant that was when we would respond, not day 1 or 2. Day 3. The cooperative delegation spent those 2 days on the station. They toured the facilities, which were impressive by design, but not ostentatiously so. They ate in the shared dining area where they were surrounded by human staff who were friendly and busy and clearly not suffering from isolation or resource scarcity. The economic analysts asked Claire Holden a number of questions about supply chains and maintenance schedules. She answered every one of them fully and accurately. The answers were all good news. That was not an accident either. On the morning of day 3, I was walking the corridor to the conference room when I fell into step beside one of the Tavith legal advisors. Her name, for the delegation roster, was Ventesa. She had been taking notes constantly since she arrived, a small Tavith habit of documentation that I recognized from my liaison years. She looked at me and then looked away, the way Tavith does when they want to speak, but calculating the etiquette. I waited. She said quietly, "The station medical bay equipment." I said yes. She said, "We do not have that equipment in the cooperative space." I said, "I know." She said nothing else. She turned off at the corridor junction and went the other way. But the way she said it stayed with me. Not as an accusation, not with envy, with something quieter, which was closer to an accounting, an inventory of what the cooperative had not had and had not noticed it was missing. Ford sat down at the conference table at 9 in the morning on day 3 and told Cell that the Human Republic had considered the cooperative's proposal carefully and that we had an answer. The answer was no. Not to dialogue, not to a relationship, not to the specific proposal as structured. We were not interested in returning to the cooperative as members of any kind. We were not interested in oversight mechanisms described as consultation. We were not interested in any framework that treated the past 50 years as an interruption in the natural order of things rather than what it had actually been, which was a transformation in the actual order of things. What we were interested in, Ford said, was a trade agreement, comprehensive, bilateral, specific goods, services, technology on terms that both parties negotiated freely as sovereign equals. Ort Hell was very still. Ford said the Human Republic would also welcome a formal application from the cooperative for associate partner status. Associate partners received access to human transit corridors, shared research databases, and joint infrastructure projects. Associate partners did not have oversight authority over human governance or expansion. I watched Orthal's translator unit process the phrase associate partner status. The unit was high-quality cooperative technology, the best available. It managed the translation in 3 seconds. Then Orthal's crest feathers did the thing they had done when he stepped onto the station. He said, "We are proposing that the cooperative apply to join your framework." Ford said, "We are proposing a partnership of equals in which both parties access the formal structure that best serves their interests. The cooperative is welcome to pursue observer status initially if the full associate application requires internal approval time." Ort Hell looked at me. I was not sure why. Maybe because I had been around long enough that he had read my history, the liaison years, the banishment terror consulting, and he was looking for something familiar in a room that had stopped being familiar the moment he walked in. I looked back at him steadily and said nothing. The negotiation took 4 more days. Ford's team handled the technical sessions. I sat in on 2 of them and spent the rest of my time talking with Ventesa and one of the oral analysts, a being named Rethol, who was deeply and openly curious about the human education system and kept asking questions I found more and more interesting as the days went on. The final agreement was not everything we wanted or everything the cooperative wanted. That is what an agreement between equals looks like. There was one clause I negotiated personally. I asked for it in a private session with Orth on the last afternoon, just the two of us and our translators. It was a short clause. It said that the cooperative's formal record of the banishment would include a notation that the banishment had not achieved its intended effect. Orth said that was a symbolic request. I said yes. He looked at me for a long moment, then he signed. I thanked him. I meant it. The clause was symbolic in the way that most true things are symbolic. It would be in the record for as long as the record existed. Every historian, every student, every young diplomat who pulled those files in the centuries to come would read it. The cooperative told us we were finished. We grew. I thought that was worth putting in writing. I want to tell you something about the Norman Ventace's great-grandchild who knocked on my door. The child's name was D.A. She was 9 years old, born on Kepler 438b, which meant she had never known cooperative spaces, never stood in those cool, carefully calibrated halls, never eaten food produced to cooperative nutritional standards, never heard the formal cadences of the cooperative's official dialects as a living language. She spoke the local human dialect and one oral trade language she had picked up from a family 3 houses down the ridge. When she knocked on my door that morning, she was carrying a soil sample in a sealed glass jar, which she held out to me and said she had found it in the Eastern Ridge Cave system and wanted to know what it was. I told her to come in and we would look at it together. I am at this point 103 years old. I say this not to be impressive, but because it matters to the story and because it still catches me slightly when I say it out loud. The cellular work that the first generation of researchers developed in those early post-finishment years has moved through several generations of refinement since. And the practical effect for my specific biology has been that the decline I expected has arrived more slowly and more gently than I was prepared for. I am not a young woman, but I am a functional, mobile, thinking person who can still read soil sample data without assistance, which is not nothing. Des sat at my kitchen table while I ran the jar through the portable analyzer George Farrow had given me when he moved to the new settlement further north. 5 years ago, following his geological survey into a region he described as the most interesting rock formation he had found in 40 years of looking at rocks. He was 89 when he left. He sent me samples every few months. I ran them and sent him the results, and we talked about what they meant, and sometimes we disagreed, and the disagreements were always productive. The sample DA had brought was a mineral composite I had not seen before. It had properties that the analyzer flagged as unusual. Smells. The kind of flag that in scientific language means there is more here than the instrument can tell you with confidence. I told Dotties and watched her face. She said, "So it means we have to look harder." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." I was hopping. It meant that. I thought about that response for the rest of the day after Desad had gone home for dinner. The ease of it, the completeness of it, not the acceptance of a child who does not know enough to worry, but something more specific than that. The confidence of a person who has grown up in an environment where unknown things are understood to be worth investigating rather than worth avoiding. DA had been born on a Class Omega world. Her parents had chosen it deliberately. Her grandparents had immigrated from cooperative space for reasons that had changed over the years they spent here until the reasons themselves were barely recognizable. They had come looking for an opportunity. They had stayed because they had stopped being afraid of the things the cooperative had taught them to be afraid of. Lidhel arrived 2 weeks after Daz's visit. Lith was Orthel's grandchild, a Finland scholar, 26 years old, working on what they described in their initial message as a historical study of the banishment era and its aftermath. They wanted to interview me. I said yes with the condition that the interview happened here at the farmhouse over several days and that Lith did some of the farming work in exchange. I was not entirely joking about the farming work. Lith arrived with a recording unit, a data notebook, and an expression that I recognized from my own face in the mirror when I was a young diplomat encountering something I had studied thoroughly and was not yet fully equipped to understand. They were careful. They were respectful. And they were beneath the professional manner, genuinely and helplessly curious. We sat on the porch the first evening watching the amber sunset that I had now watched from this ridge for 70 years, and Lyeth said, "I want to understand why you smiled." I asked which smile they meant. Lith said in the Grand Conclave when the banishment was announced, "The historical record shows that the human delegation smiled. Every account from multiple species who were present describes it the same way. Most analysis of the banishment era identifies that moment as significant, but no analysis I have read explains it satisfactorily. I looked at the amber sky. I had thought about this question for many decades, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer was the kind of thing that was easy to say incorrectly, and saying it incorrectly had always seemed worse than saying nothing. I said, "Are you afraid of things, Lith?" They considered this. A vehicle considering something will go very still, the way deep water goes still before it moves. Lith said, "Yes, there are many things I find frightening." I said, "What do you do when you encounter them?" Lith said, "I assess them. I determine the level of risk. If the risk is manageable, I proceed carefully. If the risk is not manageable, I look for an alternative path." I nodded. I said, "What if there is no alternative path?" Lith was quiet for a moment. Then they said that the situation is considered an obstacle that requires escalation to a broader decision-making framework. I said, "What does that mean in practice?" They thought about it. Then, with the honesty of someone who has not yet learned to be dishonest about things that reflect on their civilization, they said, "It means we wait. We wait until the problem changes or until someone else finds a way around it." I said, "Yes, that is what I thought." I did not say it harshly. I want to make that clear. I have never found the cooperative's way of being frightening or contemptible. It is simply a different relationship with the universe. It came from a different kind of history, a history of stability, of environments that were worth maintaining, of social structures that rewarded patience and collaboration and caution. The cooperative built something genuinely remarkable under those conditions. I have always believed that. But humans did not come from stability. I told Lith this. I told them about the planet where we evolved. A planet we had never classified in any formal lethality index because we did not have one when we were looking at it, but which would have scored high by any external measure. We had ice ages. We had supervolcanoes. We had collisions with objects from space. We had periods of drought that lasted centuries. We had predators, diseases, cold, heat, floods, and famine. And we had each other, which was sometimes the most complicated threat of all. And somehow in all of that, we did not become careful. We became clever. We became stubborn. We became the specific variety of stubborn that does not stop when it hits a wall but starts looking for a tool. Lith said, "But you must have been afraid." I said, "Constantly. We were afraid every single day for most of our history. Afraid of the dark, afraid of the winter, afraid of the thing moving at the edge of the firelight, afraid of death, afraid of pain, afraid of each other. Fear is not something humans lack. It is something humans have in enormous quantities." I said the difference is what fear does to us. I tried to explain this. I told Lith that in most cooperative species, fear is a signal that ends the process. The nervous system reads the danger, calculates the risk, and chooses the path of reduced exposure. It is rational. It works. In humans, fear is also a signal that starts the process. The nervous system reads the danger. The adrenaline sharpens the focus. And the mind begins almost involuntarily to look for the way through. We are not braver than other species. We are not less afraid. We are just wired by 100,000 years of surviving things that should have killed us to experience fear as a kind of fuel rather than a kind of stop sign. Lith said quietly, "So when the cooperative told you that you were on your own," I said, "we heard that the obstacles between us and what we wanted to build had been removed." Lith was very still. I said, "We smiled because we were relieved. 50 years of the cooperative telling us what we were not allowed to do, what research we could not pursue, what worlds we could not settle, what risks we could not take. And then in one morning all of it lifted. We were not abandoned. We were freed." Lith said, "But you could not have known it would work out." I said, "No, we could not have known that, but that is exactly the point." I let that sit for a moment. The amber light was fading. The first stars were coming through the atmospheric filter, the ones bright enough to cut through, the ones I had been watching from this ridge for 7 decades. I said, "Lith, you asked me why we smiled. The real answer is this. We smiled because we had spent 60 years watching the cooperative make decisions from a position of fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what humans might do if not supervised. Fear of technologies that had not been tested. Fear of worlds that had not been cleared. And we had spent 60 years watching that fear make everything smaller, safer, and slower. And then the cooperative, in trying to punish us, accidentally gave us what every human in that room had secretly wanted: permission to stop being careful on someone else's behalf. Lith said, and if it had gone wrong? I said it would have gone wrong and we would have fixed it. That is the other thing. We are not good at knowing when something is impossible. We have tried to do impossible things so many times that we have lost some of the instinct for recognizing them in advance. This has cost us. There are failures in our history that were terrible. Expeditions that did not come back, colonies that did not survive, research paths that turned out to be wrong in costly ways. We know what failure feels like. I said, but here is the thing about a species that does not stop at the first wall or the second or the third. They build a lot of cities. I stood up and went inside. I came back with a small notebook. It was not the original. Crane's original was in a museum on Earth, but I had a copy made years ago because I wanted to be able to hold it. I handed it to Lith and told them to open it to the marked page. They read the 3 words. They looked up at me. I said, that is the whole story. 3 words written in the moment of the cooperative. Announced our banishment. Finally, no oversight. Not defiance, not bravado, relief. The relief of a species that had just been told the only thing standing between them and their potential was themselves. Lith held the notebook carefully. The way you hold something that has become more than an object. They said, the cooperative's analysts still argue about this. Some believe that the human expansion during the banishment years was a lucky accident that the conditions happened to align. Others believe it was a deliberate strategy from the beginning. I said it was neither. It was something harder to model than either. It was people responding to their circumstances the way they always respond to their circumstances, by moving forward, by trying things, by failing and trying again. There was no grand plan in that chamber. There was a man writing 3 words in a notebook and a woman reading them over his shoulder and understanding what they meant about the next 50 years. There was a species that had just been told the galaxy did not want them and had simply decided to build one that did. It said nothing for a long time. The stars were properly out now. The settlement lights in the valley were steady below us. The amber sky had gone dark blue and the edge of it was starting to show the first deep purple that preceded the night. Lith finally said, I think I understand. I said, you will understand it better when you go home and realize you are not afraid of the journey. They looked at me. I said, you came to Kepler 438b. You came to a Class Omega world to interview an old woman about history. In cooperative space, that trip is not something young scholars do. The lethality index, the risk assessment, the medical preclearance, the emergency protocols, but you came anyway. Lith looked at me very carefully and said, I was afraid to come. I said, I know that you came anyway. That I told them is the whole thing right there. You were afraid and you came anyway. And now you are sitting on the porch of a farmhouse on a world the galaxy gave up on watching stars that do not care about any of our arguments, and you have been perfectly fine. Fear did not stop you. Lith said, but I had to work very hard to override it. I said yes. So did we. For 100,000 years we had to work very hard to override it. And then it started becoming natural. And now it is just how we are. That is the thing I had never found a clean way to say. It was not that humans did not feel fear. It was that we had practiced moving through it for so long that the practice had become physiology. The gap between feeling the fear and acting despite it had compressed over generations from something that required enormous effort into something that required only the ordinary daily courage that we did not even recognize as courage because it had become so routine. DA had looked at an unknown soil sample and said good. I was hoping it meant that she was 9. She had not fought her way to that response. It was simply her first response. It was the response of a child who had been born into a world that taught her from the beginning that the unknown was an invitation. Lith left the next morning. We had talked for 4 days, not just that evening. We walked the ridge, visited the cave system that DA had been exploring, ate dinner with George Farrow over a video call in which he asked Lith a series of questions about Velan geological survey methods with the cheerful focus of a man who has never stopped wanting to know more about the world. We had sat in the kitchen and gone through 40 years of my personal correspondence, pointing out the moments that seemed to matter. At the shuttle bay, Lith said, I will write this accurately. I said, I know you will. They said, I have one more question. I waited. They said, was it worth it? All of it. The banishment, the years alone, the years of building for humanity as a whole. Was it worth what it cost? I thought about the class Omega worlds with thriving cities. I thought about the research that had changed the shape of human lives. I thought about Dad at my kitchen table with a soil sample. That flash of delight when I said the result was uncertain. The exact pleasure of a child who has been handed a puzzle. I thought about the 12 million, and then the 40 million, and then the 200 million non-human citizens who had chosen to come and build something alongside us. I thought about Vol's message 30 years ago. We do not understand what we are seeing, and the pride I had felt reading it. Not the pride of superiority, but the pride of having been underestimated and having responded well. I thought about Oliver Crane's 3 words. I said, the cooperative thought it was a punishment. We thought it was a starting line. You tell me which one of those framings produced the better outcome. Lith made the velvet expression I had learned finally in my 8th decade of studying their species to identify reliably. It was the expression that corresponded as closely as biology permitted to the human experience of recognizing something as true that you had not quite been willing to admit before. I had first seen that expression on Lith's face in the negotiation room 60 years ago, when Ford told him the Human Republic was open to reviewing the cooperative's application for associate status. I saw it now on his grandchild's face, standing in a shuttle bay on a world the galaxy had declared uninhabitable with a notebook containing 3 words tucked carefully under one arm. They boarded the shuttle. I walked back to the farmhouse. The tomatoes needed water. The eastern ridge was going amber with morning light. Somewhere in the cave system underneath that ridge, a 9-year-old child was probably already back at work with her sample jars and her questions. I picked up the watering can. Dan knocked on the door an hour later with a second sample from a different layer of the cave. She held it up. Her face was completely lit. She said, "The analyzer is going to flag this one, too. I can already tell." I said, "Then let us find out what it is." We went inside and got started.